Remembrance Day 2024, Ishida Castle, the Goto Islands, Nagasaki, Japan. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are again at Ishida Castle in Goto City, in the Goto Islands, Nagasaki Prefecture, Japan, to observe Remembrance Day for Japan. Today we are joined by Tomoko Akiyama from Tottori Prefecture, Tokyo, and Goto. This castle was the last castle to be built in Japan. It was begun in 1849 and due to construction difficulties was not completed until 1853. It held a battery of coastal artillery when completed. Its usefulness was brief, and after the Meiji Restoration, it was abandoned in 1872. Since then, it had become a government office, then, over the years, became changed to its current form. It now houses the Nagasaki Prefectural Goto High School, Goto City Fukue Cultural Center, and the Goto Tourism History Museum. The museum has 3 floors of exhibits, with a cultural movie theater on the first floor. There are exhibits about the ruling Goshima clan, artifacts of the Tokugawa period and Meiji Restoration, as well as the Jomon period exhibits on the second floor. On the third floor, there are cultural and festival displays, as well as displays about fishing and whale hunting. There is also a large display area with a video about the hidden Christians of the Goto Islands. Why are we here? Great Britain and Japan entered into an alliance from 1902 to 1923. It was entered through mutual interests and served Japan particularly well in their war with Russia in 1903, preventing the French from assisting the Russians, as that would mean war between Britain and France. As Japan gained more power in Asia, at this time particularly over Korea, America did not approve of the arrangement, and Australia didn't feel comfortable with it either. Canada would also not approve of it in 1919, following the First World War, due to Japanese expansion interests. The 553 Treaty, part of the Washington Treaty on Naval Limitations, allowed Japan parity with the great naval powers, Britain and America, as they had to spread their fleets over many oceans. The alliance was ended in 1923 due to conflicting alliance pressures and mutual distrust. In the First World War, however, the alliance was solid and enabled for the Allies to take the German port of Tsingtao, as well as defeat the German East Asia Squadron. The Siege of Tsingtao was the attack on the German port of Qingdao, known then as Tsingtao, in China, during World War I by Japan and the United Kingdom, with some British Empire also involved. When the war in Europe began in August 1914, Britain promptly requested Japanese assistance. A combined Japanese and British Empire force made a short campaign in the autumn of 1914, besieging Tsingtao from October 31st and capturing it on November 7, 1914, thus ending major operations in the Pacific in World War I. This year marks the 110th anniversary of these events in World War I. This year marks the 80th anniversaries of many battles and campaigns in World War II. Today we are focusing on the events in the Pacific Theater during 1944. In Europe, it marked the continuation of battles on the Eastern Front, with the USSR slowly crushing the German forces and the remaining territories still held by the Germans in Russia, and the retreat back into Poland. In Western Europe, the campaigns in Italy and the landings in Normandy occurred, with the eventual liberation of Paris, Rome, and most of Belgium and Holland. Japanese offensives in Asia, 1944. Japanese counteroffensives in China, 1944. In mid-1944, Japan mobilized over 500,000 men and launched a massive operation across China under the code name Operation Ichigo, their largest offensive of World War II, with the goal of connecting Japanese-controlled territory in China and French Indochina and capturing air bases in southeastern China where American bombers were based. During this time, about 250,000 newly American-trained Chinese troops under Joseph Stilwell and Chinese expeditionary forces were forcibly locked in the Burmese theater by the terms of the Lend-Lease Agreement. Though Japan suffered about 100,000 casualties, these attacks, the biggest in several years, gained much ground for Japan before Chinese forces stopped the incursions in Guangxi. Despite major tactical victories, the operation overall failed to provide Japan with any significant strategic gains. A great majority of the Chinese forces were able to retreat out of the area and later come back to attack Japanese positions at the Battle of West Hunan. Japan was not any closer to defeating China after this operation, and the constant defeats the Japanese suffered in the Pacific meant that Japan never got the time and resources needed to achieve final victory over China. Operation Ichigo created a great sense of social confusion in the areas of China that it affected. Chinese communist guerrillas were able to exploit this confusion to gain influence and control of greater areas of the countryside in the aftermath of Ichigo. The Japanese offensive in Burma, 1944. After the Allied setbacks in 1943, the Southeast Asia Command prepared to launch offensives into Burma on several fronts. In the first months of 1944, the Chinese and American troops of the Northern Area Command, NCAC, commanded by the American Joseph Stilwell, began extending the Ledo Road from India into northern Burma, while the Indian 15th Corps began an advance along the coast in Arakan province. In February 1944, the Japanese mounted a local counterattack in Arakan. After early Japanese success, this counterattack was defeated in the Battle of the Admin Box, while the Indian divisions of 15th Corps stood firm, relying on aircraft to drop supplies to isolated forward units until reserve divisions could relieve them. The Japanese launched a long-planned offensive of their own into India in the middle of March, across the mountainous and densely forested frontier. This attack, codenamed Operation Yugo, was advocated by Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, the recently promoted commander of the Japanese 15th Army. Imperial General Headquarters endorsed the plan despite misgivings by Mutaguchi's subordinates and staffs at Japanese Burma Area Army and Southern Expeditionary Army Group. Lieutenant General Slim, commanding the British 14th Army, and his forward commander, Lieutenant General Jeffrey Scoons, planned to withdraw into the Imphal Plain in Manipur State and force the Japanese to fight with their communications stretching over scores of miles of jungle trails. However, they were slow to respond when the attack was launched and did not foresee some Japanese objectives. Some British and Indian units had to fight their way out of encirclement, but by early April, they had concentrated around Imphal. Several units were flown from the Arakan to reinforce them. A Japanese division which had advanced to Kohima in Nagaland cut the main road to Imphal, but failed to capture the whole of the defenses at Kohima. During April, the Japanese attacks against Imphal failed, while the fresh Allied formations drove the Japanese from the positions they had partially captured at Kohima. As many Japanese had feared, their inadequate lines of communication and the failure of Mutaguchi's gamble on an early victory to allow them to capture Allied supplies meant that their troops, particularly those at Kohima, starved. Once the monsoon rains descended in the middle of May, They also succumbed to disease in large numbers. During May, while Mutaguchi continued to order attacks, the Allies advanced southwards from Kohima and northwards from Imphal. The two Allied attacks met on June 22nd, breaking the Japanese siege of Imphal. The Japanese finally broke off the operation on July 3rd. They had lost over 50,000 troops, mainly to starvation and disease. This represented the worst defeat suffered by the Imperial Japanese Army to that date. Although the advance in Arakam had been halted to release troops and aircraft for the Battle of Imphal, the Americans and Chinese had continued to advance in northern Burma, aided by the reinforced Chindits operating against the Japanese lines of communication. In the middle of 1944, the Chinese Expeditionary Force invaded northern Burma from Yunnan. They captured a fortified position at Mount Song. At the time, campaigning ceased during the monsoon. The Northern Combat Area Command had secured a vital airfield at Myitkyina after a prolonged siege, which ended in early August. Possession of the airfield eased the problems of air resupply from India to China over the hump. Beginning of the end in the Pacific, 1944. In May 1943, the Japanese prepared Operation Z, or the Z or Z plan, which envisioned the use of Japanese naval power to counter American forces threatening the outer defense perimeter line. This line extended from the Aleutians down through Wake, the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, Nauru, the Bismarck Archipelago, New Guinea, and then westward past Java and Sumatra to Burma. In 1943 to 44, Allied forces in the Solomons began driving relentlessly to Rabaul, eventually encircling and neutralizing the stronghold. With their position in the Solomons disintegrating, the Japanese modified the Z plan by eliminating the Gilbert and Marshall Islands and the Bismarck Archipelago as vital areas to be defended. They then based their possible actions on the defense of an inner perimeter, which included the Marianas, Palau, Western New Guinea, and the Dutch East Indies. Meanwhile, in the Central Pacific, the Americans initiated a major offensive, beginning in November 1943 with landings in the Gilbert Islands. The Japanese were forced to watch helplessly as their garrisons in the Gilberts and then the Marshalls were crushed. The strategy of holding overextended island garrisons was fully exposed. In February 1944, the U.S. Navy's Fast Carrier Attack Force, during Operation Hailstone, attacked the naval base of Truk. Although the Japanese had moved their major vessels out in time to avoid being caught at anchor in the atoll, 2 days of air attacks resulted in significant losses to Japanese aircraft and merchant shipping. The Japanese were forced to abandon Truk and were now unable to counter Americans on any front on the perimeter. Consequently, the Japanese retained their remaining strength in preparation for what they hoped would be a decisive battle. The Japanese then developed a new plan known as Ago. Ago envisioned a decisive fleet action that would be fought somewhere from the Palaus to the Western Carolines. It was in this area that the newly formed mobile fleet, along with large numbers of land-based aircraft, would be concentrated. If the Americans attacked in the Marianas, they would be attacked by land-based planes in the vicinity. Then the Americans would be lured into the areas where the mobile fleet could defeat them.
Marianas and Palaus. On March 12, 1944, the Joint Chiefs of Staff directed the occupation of the Northern Marianas, specifically the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. A target date was set for June 12. All forces for the Marianas operation were to be commanded by Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. The forces assigned to the command consisted of 535 warships and auxiliaries, together with the ground force of 3.5 marine divisions and one reinforced army division, a total of more than 127,500 troops. For the Americans, the Marianas operation would provide the following benefits: the interruption of the Japanese air pipeline to the south, the development of advanced naval bases for submarines and surface operations, the establishment of airfields to base B-29s from which to bomb the Japanese home islands, and the choice among several possible objectives for the next phase of operations, which would keep the Japanese uncertain of American intentions. It was also hoped that this penetration of the Japanese in the defense zone, which was a little more than 1,250 miles or 2,010 kilometers from Tokyo, might force the Japanese spread out for a decisive engagement. The ability to plan and execute such a complex operation in the space of 90 days was indicative of Allied logistical superiority. On June 15, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, supported by a naval bombardment group totaling 8 battleships, 11 cruisers, and 26 destroyers, landed on Saipan. However, Japanese fire was so effective that the first day objective was not reached until day 3. After fanatic Japanese resistance, the Marines captured Aslito Airfield in the south on June 18. U.S. Navy Seabees quickly made the field operation null for use for American aircraft. On June 22nd, the front of the northward advancing 2nd and 4th Marine Division widened to such a degree that General Howard Smith ordered the Book of the Army's 27th Division to take over the line in the center between the two U.S. Marine divisions. The 27th Division was late taking its position and was late in making advances, so that the inner flanks of the Marine divisions became exposed. A giant U was formed with the 27th at the base, 1,500 yards or 1.4 kilometers behind the advancing formations. This presented the Japanese with an opportunity to exploit it. On June 24th, General Poland Smith replaced General Lawrence C. Smith, the commanding general of the 27th Division, who he believed lacked an aggressive spirit. Northern Saipan's southern point was secured on June 27th after the Japanese troops trapped there expended themselves in a desperate attempt to break through. In the north, Mount Tapocho, the highest point on the island, was taken on June 27th. The Marines steadily advanced northward. On the night of July 6th, 7th, a banzai attack took place in which there are 3 to 4,000 Japanese made a fanatic charge that penetrated the line via Tanabak before being wiped out. Following this attack, hundreds of the native population committed mass suicide by throwing themselves off the cliffs onto the rocks below near the northern tip of the island. On July 9th, 2 days after the banzai attack, organized resistance on Saipan ceased. The U.S. Marines reached the northernmost tip of Saipan, Murphy Point, 24 days after the landing. Only isolated groups of hidden Japanese remained. A month after the invasion of Saipan, the U.S. captured Guam and captured Tinian. Once captured, the islands of Saipan and Tinian were used extensively by the United States military as they finally put mainland Japan within round-trip range of B-29 bombers. In response, Japanese forces attacked the bases on Saipan and Tinian from November 1944 to January 1945. At the same time and afterwards, the United States Army Air Forces, based out of these islands, conducted an intense started its bombing campaign against the Japanese cities of military and industrial importance, including Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and others. The invasion of Peru in the Palau Islands on September 15th was notable for a drastic change in Japanese defensive tactics. resulting in the highest casualty rate amongst U.S. forces in an amphibious operation during the Pacific War. Instead of the predicted 4 days, it took until November 27th to secure the island. The ultimate threat starts. The value of the landing is still contested.
Philippine Sea. When the Americans landed on Saipan in the Marianas, the Japanese viewed holding Saipan as an imperative. Consequently, the Japanese responded with their largest carrier force of the war. This was the 9-carrier mobile fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, supplemented by an additional 500 land-based aircraft. Facing them was the U.S. Fifth Fleet under the command of Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, which contained 15 fleet carriers and 956 aircraft. The clash was the largest carrier battle in history. The battle did not turn out as the Japanese had hoped. During the previous month, U.S. destroyers had destroyed 17 out of 25 submarines in Ozawa's screening force, and repeated American air raids destroyed the Japanese land-based aircraft. On June 19th, a series of Japanese carrier airstrikes were shattered by strong American defenses. The result was later dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. All U.S. carriers had combat information centers, which interpreted the flow of radar data and radioed interception orders to the combat air patrols. The few Japanese attackers that managed to reach the U.S. fleet in a staggered sequence encountered massive anti-aircraft fire with proximity fuses. Only one American warship was slightly damaged. On the same day, IJN Shokaku was hit by 4 torpedoes from the submarine Kavala and sank with heavy loss of life. The IJN Taiho was also sunk by a single torpedo. This was the biggest aircraft carrier in the Japanese Navy. From the submarine Albacore. The next day, the Japanese carrier force was subjected to an American carrier attack and suffered the loss of the carrier IJN Hio. The 4 Japanese airstrikes involved 373 carrier aircraft, of which 130 returned to the carriers. Many of these survivors were subsequently lost when IJN Taiho and IJN Shikaku were sunk by American submarine attacks. After the second day of the battle, losses totaled 3 carriers and 445 aircrew, with more than 433 carrier aircraft and around 200 land-based aircraft lost. The Americans lost 130 aircraft and 76 aircrew, many losses due to aircraft running out of fuel, returning to their carriers at night. Although the defeat at the Philippine Sea was severe in terms of the loss of the 3 fleet carriers IJN Taiho, IJN Shikaku, and the IJN Hio, the real disaster was in the annihilation of the carrier air groups. These losses to the already outnumbered Japanese fleet air arm were irreplaceable. The Japanese had spent the better part of a year reconstituting their carrier air groups, and the Americans had destroyed 90% of it in 2 days. The Japanese had only enough pilots left to form the air group for one of their light carriers. The mobile fleet returned home with only 35 aircraft of the 430 with which it had begun the battle. The battle ended in a total Japanese defeat and resulted in the virtual end of the carrier force. Leyte Gulf, 1944. The disaster at the Philippine Sea left the Japanese with 2 choices. They were either to commit their remaining strength in an all-out offensive or to sit by while the Americans occupied the Philippines and cut the sea lanes between Japan and the vital resources from the Dutch East Indies and Malaya. Thus, the Japanese devised a plan which represented a final attempt to force a decisive battle by utilizing their last remaining strength, the firepower of its heavy cruisers and battleships, against the American beachhead at Leyte. The Japanese planned to use their remaining carriers as bait in order to lure the American carriers away from Leyte Gulf, long enough for the heavy warships to enter and to destroy any American ships present. The Japanese assembled a force totaling 4 carriers, 9 battleships, 14 heavy cruisers, 7 light cruisers, and 35 destroyers. They split into 3 forces. The center force was under the command of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita and consisted of 5 battleships, including the IGN Yamato and IGN Musashi, 12 cruisers, and 13 destroyers. The northern force was under the command of Chisaburo Ozawa and comprised of 4 carriers, 2 battleships partly converted to carriers, 3 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The southern force contained 2 groups, one under the command of Shoji Nishimura, consisting of 2 Fuso-class battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers. The main center force would pass through the San Bernardino Strait into the Philippine Sea, turn southwards, and then attack the landing area. The 2 separate groups of the northern force with the Japanese carriers would lure the main American covering forces away from Leyte. The carriers embarked a total of just 108 aircraft. However, after center force departed from Brunei Bay on October 23rd, 2 American submarines attacked it, resulting in the loss of 2 heavy cruisers with another crippled. Another entering the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th, center force was assaulted by American carrier aircraft throughout the whole day, forcing another heavy cruiser to retire. The Americans then targeted the IGN Musashi and sank it under a barrage of torpedo and bomb hits. Many other ships of center force were attacked but continued on. Convinced that their attacks had made center force ineffective, the American carriers headed north to address the newly detected threat of the Japanese carriers of Ozawa's northern force. On the night of October 24th to 25th, the southern force under Nishimura attempted to enter Leyte Gulf from the south through the Surigao Strait, where an American-Australian force led by Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf and consisting of 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 26 destroyers ambushed the Japanese. Utilizing radar-guided torpedo attacks, American destroyers sank one of the battleships and 3 destroyers while damaging the other battleship. Radar-guided naval fire then finished off the second battleship, with only a single Japanese destroyer surviving. As a result of observing radio silence, Shima's group was unable to coordinate and synchronize its movements with Nishimura's group, and subsequently arrived at Surigao Strait in the middle of the encounter. After making a haphazard torpedo attack, Shima retreated. Off Cape Engano, 500 miles, 800 kilometers north of Leyte Gulf, the Americans launched over 500 aircraft sorties at the northern force, followed up by a surface group of cruisers and destroyers. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk, but this part of the Japanese plan had succeeded in drawing the American carriers away from Leyte Gulf. On October 25th, the final major surface action fought between the Japanese and American fleets during the war occurred off Samar, when center force fell upon a group of American escort carriers escorted only by destroyers and destroyer escorts. Both sides were surprised, but the outcome looked certain since the Japanese had 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, leading 2 destroyer squadrons. However, they did not press home their advantage and were content to conduct a largely indecisive gunnery duel before breaking off. Japanese losses were extremely heavy, with 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers sunk, while the Americans lost only one light carrier and two escort carriers, a destroyer, and two destroyer escorts. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, arguably the largest naval battle in history, was the largest naval battle of World War II. For the Japanese, the defeat at Leyte Gulf was catastrophic. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered its greatest ever loss of ships and men in combat. The inevitable liberation of the Philippines also meant that the home islands would be virtually cut off from the vital resources from Japan's occupied territories in Southeast Asia. Philippines, 1944 to 1945. On October 20th, 1944, the U.S. 6th Army, supported by naval and air bombardment, landed on the favorable eastern shore of Leyte, north of Mindanao. The U.S. 6th Army continued its advance from the east, while the Japanese rushed reinforcements to the Ormoc Bay area on the western side of the island. The U.S. reinforced the 6th Army successfully, but the U.S. 5th Air Force devastated Japanese attempts to resupply. In torrential rains and over difficult terrain, the U.S. advance continued across Leyte and the neighboring island of Samar to the north. On December 7th, U.S. Army units landed at Ormoc Bay and, after a major land and air battle, cut off the Japanese ability to reinforce and supply Leyte. Although fierce fighting continued on Leyte for months, the U.S. Army was in control. On December 15th, 1944, landings against minimal resistance took place on the southern beaches on the island of Mindoro, a key location in the planned Lingayen Gulf operations, in support of major landings scheduled on Luzon. On January 9, 1945, General Kruger's 6th Army landed its first units on the south shore of Lingayen Gulf, on the western coast of Luzon. Almost 175,000 men followed across the 20-mile or 32-kilometer beachhead within a few days. With heavy air support, Army units pushed inland, taking Clark Field, 40 miles or 64 kilometers northwest of Manila, in the last week of January. Two more major landings followed, one to cut off the Bataan Peninsula and another that included a parachute drop south of Manila. Pincers closed on the city, and on February 3rd, 1945, elements of 1st Cavalry Division pushed into the northern outskirts of Manila, and the 8th Cavalry passed through the northern suburbs and into the city itself. The month-long battle for Manila resulted in over 100,000 civilian deaths and was the scene of the worst urban fighting fought by American forces in the Pacific Theater. As the advance on Manila continued from the north and the south, the Bataan Peninsula was rapidly secured. On February 16th, paratroopers and amphibious units assaulted the island fortress of Corregidor, and resistance ended there on February 27th. In all, 10 U.S. divisions and 5 independent regiments battled on Luzon, making it the largest campaign of the Pacific War, involving more troops than the United States had used in North Africa, Italy, southern France, and southern France. Forces included the Mexican Escuadron 201 Fighter Squadron as part of the Fuerza Aérea Expedicionaria Mexicanas, FAEM, or the Mexican Expeditionary Air Force, with the squadron attached to the 58th Fighter Group of the United States Army Air Forces that flew tactical support missions. Of the 250,000 Japanese troops defending Luzon, 80% died. The last remaining Japanese soldier in the Philippines, Hiro Onoda, surrendered on March 9, 1974. The 8th Army invaded Palawan Island between Borneo and Mindoro, the 5th largest and westernmost Philippine island, on February 28, 1945, with landings at Puerto Princesa. The Japanese put up little direct defense of Palawan, but cleaning up pockets of Japanese resistance lasted until late April, as the Japanese used their common tactic of withdrawing into the mountain jungles, dispersed as small units. Throughout the Philippines, Filipino guerrillas aided U.S. forces to find and dispatch the holdouts. The U.S. 8th Army then moved on to its first landing on Mindanao, April 17th, the last of the major Philippine islands to be taken. Then followed the invasion and occupation of Panay, Cebu, Negros, and several islands in the Sulu archipelago. These islands provided bases for the U.S. 5th and 13th Air Forces to attack targets throughout the Philippines and South China Sea. This ends the telling of the Western Allies and Japanese fighting events of 1944 and a little into 1945. This was 80 years ago this year. As for the Remembrance Day ceremonies, Remembrance Day was first observed in 1919 throughout the British Commonwealth. It was originally called Armistice Day to commemorate the armistice agreement that ended the First World War on Monday, November 11, 1918 at 11 a.m. on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. From 1921 to 1930, Armistice Day was held on the Monday of the week in which November 11 fell. In 1931, this was changed so that the ceremony was only held on November 11th. This was also the year that the name changed to Remembrance Day. Every year on November 11th, British, Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders, among other Commonwealth countries, pause for a moment of silence to honor and remember the men and women who have served and continue to serve their countries during times of war, conflict, and peace. Other nations that are not Commonwealth members also observe Remembrance Day. These include France, Belgium, and Poland. The United States used to commemorate Remembrance Day on November 11th, but that changed in 1951 to Veterans Day in May. The ceremony is usually observed through the marching groups forming up and moving to the local cenotaph. The veterans of the area would lead, then the local serving military, then police, then cadets. They are usually led by a bagpipe band and a color guard, carrying the flags of the country. The veterans of the area would lead, then the local serving military, then police, then cadets. They are usually led by a bagpipe band and color guard, carrying the flags of the country, province, and legion. They may even include the colors of the local reserve regiments. The ceremony includes a church service and a speech in memory of the fallen. The cenotaph is guarded by a few chosen soldiers who, while armed, have no ammunition. A moment of silence is observed for about a minute, then taps is played, either on a trumpet or a bagpipe. The ceremony is then concluded by the laying of wreaths by different groups and families in memory of the fallen. The parade is then marched back to the local Legion Hall for warm soup and coffee. Millions have served and died in battlefields all over the world in service to their countries, God, King, or Queen, and the Commonwealth, or Empire at the time. It is very important to remember their sacrifices and teach the younger generations about why they served. Today, it has become even more important as educational systems seem to be failing in teaching history, for veterans to pass on the stories of those who have gone before us. We must remember our heritage. The poppy is the symbol of Remembrance Day. Replica poppies are usually given for a voluntary donation by the British Legion, Royal Canadian Legion, or the Australian and New Zealand Legions. The proceeds go to assist the surviving veterans of conflicts around the world. The red poppy is the only acceptable color for the poppy, as anything else politicizes the poppy. Remembrance Day is non-political, and the intervention of other colors for political statements is not welcome. The poppy, as a symbol of remembrance, goes back even further than World War I. At the time of the Napoleonic Wars, the graves of soldiers who were buried in Flanders were observed to have these red poppies growing over them. Red is the only color that these poppies grow in. We will now recite the poem written by Colonel John McCrae during the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915. In Flanders fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. We will now have a toast to the fallen. Ladies and gentlemen, to the King, the American Constitution,
Reiwa Emperor.
and to the fallen. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. That concludes today's commemorations.